Welcome to ArtNow, the Columbia College Chicago Art and Art History Department's curricularized one-credit speaker series, where students learn about and engage with a diverse mix of art makers, curators, critics, historians, and entrepreneurs, international, national, and Chicago-based, who are actively authoring the culture of our times. Lecture participants are exposed to the rich range of perspectives, practices, and professional pathways possible for the contemporary creative. I'd like to thank Mimi Yu, who organizes, films, and edits our lectures, Sam Foster, our graduate teaching assistant, colleagues Joan Giroux, Adam Brooks, and Amy Mooney, Gina Ordaz for her help with our guests and student visits, and of course our chair, Duncan McKenzie. And now I'd like to briefly share with you some of our speakers from this semester. Our Art Now series is live streamed via YouTube. And on February 17th, we hosted Amy Mooney, Columbia College Chicago art historian. On March 3rd, we hosted Paul Socarides, artist and director of Haystack Mountain School of Crafts. March 17th, Natani Nota joined us, an artist and educator. And here we are this evening with Sampada Aranke, who I'm so excited to be introducing momentarily. And we have a reschedule for April 28th for Lily Kays, Columbia College Chicago Interdisciplinary Arts alumna. It is now my great honor and pleasure to introduce Sampada Aranke, an assistant professor in the Art History, Theory, Criticism Department at the School of the Art Institute, Chicago. Her research interests include performance theories of embodiment, visual culture, and Black culture and aesthetic theory. Her work has been published in e-flux, Artforum, Art Journal, Equid Novi, African Journalism Studies, and Transcripts, an interdisciplinary online journal in the Humanities and Social Sciences at UC Irvine. She has written catalog essays for Sadie Barnette, Rashid Johnson, Kambui Olujimi, Sable Elyse Smith, and Zachary Fabri. She recently received the Art Journal Award for Blackouts and Other Visual Escapes, which appeared in the Winter 2020 issue. This juried award is presented annually to the most distinguished contribution published in Art Journal. She is currently working on her book manuscript entitled Death's Futurity, The Visual Life of Black Power. And without further ado, welcome, Sampada. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Mel. I'm so grateful and humbled to be here. I want to thank Amy Mooney, my dear colleague and friend who initially proposed the idea, and Melissa and Joan for so graciously hosting me. Of course, to Gina and Mimi for your logistical magic, and Sam for your time and energy. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in on this Wednesday night. I hope you have a nice, refreshing cold drink in your hand. And then finally, this project couldn't live without Bobby Hutton, Fred Hampton, George Jackson, and all the Black radicals who lived, worked, and died for the cause. It's also mostly indebted to those who continue to work despite the unbearable conditions that make that work near impossible. I'm going to share my screen. I'm really excited to share with you today a kind of brief overview of my book project, and then I'm going to zoom in on the final chapter of the book, and I really look forward to our conversation after. In Death's Futurity, The Visual Life of Black Power, I analyze how death was rhetorically and visually imagined and mobilized as a politically generative tool in the face of state-sanctioned violence during the Black Power era. Mobilizing archival findings that have never been published, this book argues for an attuned attention to the ephemera that circulated in the wake of 3 spectacular murders of Black Panther Party members between 1968 and 1971. Each chapter pairs one object made in response to one murder in order to offer up a series of provocations in terms of the centrality of death in 1960s Black radical politics. Upon research at the Schomburg Center for Black Culture, Columbia University Archives, and the African American Museum of Oakland, I came across a variety of original print culture, some of which you'll see. ranging from political posters, original journalistic publications, community organizing meeting notes, and documentary photography. All of these objects catalog how profoundly state murders of Black radicals inform the political agenda of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. By incorporating these archival objects into the project, I've chosen to recompose the histories and theories of Blackness in relation to radical political praxis and the visual cultural productions that were produced as part of a revolutionary Black politic. Though seemingly fixed, these archival documents continue to shift, emerge, and appear institutionally and otherwise, like the image you see now, a list of books in George Jackson's prison cell library in San Quentin, a document only recently released by the California Department of Corrections. The objects I have chosen here are ones whose primary purpose were for political use, whether political posters intended to be wheat pasted in public places or weekly newspapers for distribution within Black neighborhoods. These documents were never intended to be housed within museum collections. I wanted to reintroduce these objects into their original condition of living as responses to the political assassinations of well-known Black radicals in order to reveal the reappropriation of anti-Black violence in the strategy and rhetoric of revolutionary organizing. The murders of Bobby Hutton in 1968, Fred Hampton in 1969, and George Jackson in 1971 all come to signal different emergent political moves, all of which recalibrated the potential of Black radical death for revolutionary ends. In addition, the story of each murder is coupled with grassroots documentary and print media that engage the ontological status and political possibilities revealed by these murders. Chapter 1 addresses the performative strategies of original revolutionary and countercultural journalistic publications as they document continuity between Black Panther Bobby Hutton's 1968 public murder and histories of lynching in relation to visions of Black futurity, provisionally defined here as visions of Black freedom that imagined Black life beyond the structural violences of white supremacy. Hutton was both the first member of the Black Panther Party for self-defense and the first murder within the party, which made his death particularly influential in the BPP's self-fashioning as a revolutionary organization dedicated to configuring the politically generative potential of Black radical death. I draw connections between original print media and documentary footage to convey how Black radicals repurposed Hutton's murder in order to articulate a vision of Black futurity wedded to Black radical death. Here's another example. I kind of think specifically about this image of Hutton as it appears and reappears in multiple objects. In chapter 2, I illustrate how the political objects left behind from Chicago Panther Fred Hampton's gruesome 1969 murder perform the limits of the Black body as captured by the documentary footage in the murder of Fred Hampton. Hampton often publicly predicted that his own death would be a consequence of his revolutionary organizing, a reality which is captured in the film group's 1971 film. This film was initially meant to document his life, but the project was interrupted and reconceptualized following Hampton's untimely death. These scenes from Hampton's murder, his bloodied, bullet-ridden bedroom, and all the things left behind reflect how these objects make certain the revolutionary political future prefigured by his death. Here's another set of objects in his room. That's a poster of him. For today's talk, I want to focus on the final chapter of the book, which focuses on George Jackson's 1971 murder in San Quentin prison and the subsequent political posters made in response to his death. Found guilty of a $70 gas station robbery, George Jackson was incarcerated in 1960. Then 18, he was given an indeterminate sentence of 1 year to life and shuttled between various prisons in California. During his time inside, Jackson engaged in a rigorous study of political economic theory and social movements that ignited his own politicization, which eventually led to his membership to the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Jackson was a known political organizer inside and was responsible for building multiracial coalitions that aimed to engage in revolutionary warfare against capitalism. This reputation, which led to long stretches of time in solitary confinement, is also often attributed as a leading factor in his eventual murder. Jackson was gunned down on August 21st, 1971 in San Quentin prison by prison guards for allegedly trying to escape. Following a successful 30-minute takeover of a solitary confinement unit, Jackson was killed by sniper guards as he ran toward the prison wall. Autopsy and crime scene investigations confirm that Jackson did have a gun on him at the time of his murder. What is yet to be determined, however, is exactly how Jackson acquired a gun in one of the nation's most highly militarized and securitized prisons. This information is especially important given the fact that the California Department of Corrections has competing and uneven information on the status of the gun's caliber and description. The CDC paperwork confirms that San Quentin guards killed Jackson, yet there's no definitive visual evidence of how he was murdered. In a severely militarized environment heavily invested in the role of sight, surveillance, and documentation, it is highly questionable that there is no available prison archive that recorded Jackson's murder in detail. While particular state-sanctioned ephemera, like a gun used to kill Jackson, which is housed in the San Quentin Prison Museum, are preserved, archival chasing has left me empty-handed when it comes to photographs of the crime scene, first officer investigative reports, or even eyewitness accounts. It seems that all of that information has disappeared, if it even existed at all. Today, I will be discussing the final chapter of my manuscript, George Jackson's 1971 murder, and how his murder activates the relationship between slavery, lynching, and incarceration. Jackson's murder signals the transition from Black power to prison abolition. This marks a move from a political strategy of separatism into a more totalizing struggle against the prison industrial complex, which is best understood as the relationship between prisons, courts, policing, criminalization, and surveillance that anticipates and exceeds prison walls. In this chapter, I turn to two political posters as they deploy histories of anti-Black violence in order to imagine death as a means for Black liberation. These posters, along with Jackson's publications, Soledad Brother and Blood in My Eye, you see the covers of those in front of you, illustrate how state performances of anti-Black violence range from technologies of surveillance and policing, judicial structures, socioeconomic policies, incarceration, and extra-legal sanctioned vigilante practices like lynching. This chapter examines how Black expressive practices intentionally invoke Black art history in order to offer alternative compositions of corporeality. I extend art historical methods in order to describe how radicals figured the Black body in an attempt to formalize these radical alternative corporeal compositions. By attending particularly to how these artists deploy the vexed history of looking as it makes visible anti-Black violence, as well as how they visually reference Black canonical practices, today I offer a reading of Jackson's death that refashions Black corporeality in relation to dismemberment and fugitivity. While the body remains a centralizing figure in this project, I destabilize and extend the category of Black corporeality by turning to images of death in the Black Power era as they decompose the Black body into fragmented parts as a means of critiquing violence against those very bodies. This kind of compositional dismemberment allows us to imagine alternative modes of corporeal inhabitation that allow for the history of Black dispossession to be visualized within the figure. These formal attempts at dismemberment also open up fugitive possibilities that exist against that very violence. These fugitive possibilities are visually located within the very bodily sites of dismemberment that account for the violence in the first instance. In the case of Jackson's life and death, both dismemberment and fugitivity are figured in relation to the location of his murder, San Quentin Prison, one of the most notorious state penitentiaries in California. Prison is situated within a long history of disciplinary mechanisms that require the corporeal expendability of Black bodies in the service of US nation-making projects. George Jackson extensively catalogs this history in his writings. Writing from his prison cell in November 1967, Jackson notes that, quote, most Blacks understood, vaguely at least, that these places were built with us in mind, end quote. In this striking move, Jackson articulates the connection between Black corporeal expendability and the racialized regulatory function of the prison. In his 1970 preface to Jackson's Soledad Brother, written from Brazil, French philosopher and playwright Jean Genet also articulates the intensity behind this connection. Genet writes of, quote, the particular odor and texture of something written in a cell, end quote, that destroys any romance of Jackson's writing. He amplifies the conditions in which Jackson writes by naming infrastructures responsible for securing white power, which vary from walls to prison cells to trees. Genet reiterates Jackson's rigorous study of how white subjectivity, its institutions, its guards, its cells, its trees, is structured through Black murder. He ends this section of his preface by asking, how is it that whenever a white man plants a tree, he does not see a Black man hanging from it? In this striking move, Genet asks us to consider how looking practices are conditioned by this historical continuity. Put another way, how is it that every time we see a tree, it does not invoke scenes of lynching? Genet asks us to reconsider the mechanisms through which the very practice of looking, from the institutional to the natural world, are made possible by scenes of anti-Black terror. Crucial to this provocation is Genet's reminder of how we are conditioned not to see anti-Black violence in the everyday. In order for both the prison cell and the natural world to remain intact, looking practices that evoke historical practices of Black terror in a contemporary moment must remain hidden, erased, or disavowed. I take Genet's provocation with regards to not seeing and bring it to bear on the CDC's immediate and ongoing censorship surrounding the details of Jackson's 1971 murder. This censorship maps directly onto how sight informs our understanding of anti-Black violence, which is premised on practices of historical erasure. By censoring the visual evidence immediately following Jackson's 1971 murder, the CDC attempted to make invisible the conditions of his death, which would have rightfully enraged an already threatening Black power movement in the Bay Area. By reducing the scope of sight, the CDC aimed to limit the possibilities for external and internal radical resistance. The only official document I could access was that same 4-page inventory of books left in Jackson's cell, which I showed at the beginning. As scholars and artists and thinkers, we understand quite intimately that this list of books tells us an enormous amount of information about Jackson's life. You know, reading this, there's some that really strike me, like Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, a reader in Marxist philosophy, and June Jordan's Some Changes. With regard to his death, however, the lack of substantive visual evidence suggests that conditions of visibility organize how Jackson's death specifically, and anti-Black violence more generally, are historically and materially structured. Given this institutional censorship, activists and artists turn to alternative canons to recompose the visual conditions of Jackson's murder and therefore prioritize visibility in order to offer a vision of death that reconceptualized the radical Black body. I will now turn back to that poster, Power to the People, George, made by Rafael Morante, a member of the OSPAL Artists Collective, an internationalist movement that created political posters from the 60s through the 80s, whose initial goal after Jackson's death was to make visible the brutal conditions of his murder. This poster showcases how Black radical images in the 70s drew upon a long history of visual citational practices, by which I mean a deployment of previously practiced formal qualities and shared historical citations within the canon of Black art history. So clearly there is a lot to talk about with this image. And, if we had more time, I could kind of go piece by piece along the image. But for today, I want to focus and turn your eyes and your attention to the disproportionate scale of Jackson's feet. And that's really where I'll take us for the rest of today's talk. Limbs, and particularly feet, conceptually bring together three historical practices: slavery, lynching, and incarceration. Because of the use of silhouette here, Jackson's limbs are saturated in Black, the depths of which add to the severity of disproportion. The feet figured in this image direct our vision to the borders of the page, as the toes on Jackson's left foot graze the edge of the paper. Dangling over the paper's white plane, Jackson's feet seem ungrounded, untethered, as if hanging from the weight of his body. Both techniques, the appearance of a floating body and the scale of the feet, figure Jackson's enlarged feet as isolated in scale, and his body as saturated in Black. Both of these techniques resemble a long history of Black art historical citational practices that lead us back to lynching. Painted only 7 years before Power to the People, George, Jack Whitten's 1964 Head for Lynching offers us an abstraction of a head. Featureless and unattached from the rest of his body, gray tones are swallowed against a Black background, which loosely resembles a floating entity awaiting an ultimate fate. The image offers us a saturated field of blended Blacks and whites, which in their interplay form the head itself that is ripe for lynching. Whitten's use of color here marks precisely the political work of color that manifested in practices like lynching, where vigilantes enacted violence upon Black bodies. Whitten's ghostly demarcation mobilizes an intensely saturated color scheme and fragmented body part, both of which come to mark the precise coordinates of being Black under the conditions of ongoing brutal violence. In Melvin Edwards' 1966 Cotton Hang-Up, we're given another kind of floating body. Edwards composes a body with welded steel, whose weight works with gravity in its suspension overhead. Installed above gallery visitors, Edwards calls attention to the intensity of bodily proximity and height spectacularized by lynching. Named after cotton, which materially signifies Black labor, Cotton Hang-Up recomposes fragments to make a distorted and floating bodily whole. Hung up against stark white walls, the contours of sharp steel edges seem to converge at the bottom of the sculpture to form surrogate feet. Surrogate because they take the place of Black flesh, these angular feet can too be read as bare, hanging, dripping from the chain that hangs them. What links Whitten and Edwards to prints like Power to the People, George, is precisely this attention to bodily fragmentation and saturation that heightens the intensity of the act through the art object. While Whitten and Edwards compose these images through the deployment of abstraction, they approximate precisely how lynching practices necessitated the dehumanization of Black subjects and transformed victims as fragmented Black corporeal beings. This kind of commitment to fragmentation, which led to bodily dismemberment, was readily practiced during the lynching act, where Black victims' fingers and toes, among other body parts, were often dismembered and pocketed by enthusiastic onlookers as souvenirs. These corporeal objects qualify how Black visual cultural productions are seen, precisely because they gesture towards the always present history of violence enacted upon Black people. Works like those by Whitten and Edwards convey how dismemberment is a qualifying category for Black corporeality, which is in conflict with an understanding of embodiment that relies on the notion of the stable, unified, often white body. This productive tension between dismemberment and embodiment opens up a line of inquiry that unsettles how we approach the body as a whole. In other words, what might it look like to embody feet? What might it look like to embody dismemberment? In light of these questions, I offer an understanding of corporeality and dismemberment that gesture towards bodily restitution while also undoing the very category of the unified whole body. Morante's aesthetic choices make visually explicit the genealogies between lynching and incarceration as emblematized by Jackson's death. Dismemberment, because it indexes the historical practice of lynching, haunts the way we see Black corpses. My focus on dismemberment offers an intervention in Black studies that art history makes clear. The formal qualities and social history of the image radicalize the force through which Black visual practices reconceptualize the political power of death. Jackson's disproportionate feet at once contain the terror of captivity while they activate the fugitive qualities of Black life. The activation of both captivity and fugitivity requires particular looking practices that conjoin violence and terror with resistance and liberation. By exaggerating Jackson's limbs, that part of the body responsible for movement, transport, escape, Morante makes visible how Jackson's murder exists within a long history of Black murder. In so doing, the work insists we should not consider the event as immobilizing, but instead his bare feet invoke the runaway slave, a figure of Black resistance like Jackson himself. Limbs appear as a familiar trope within slave narratives, often to illustrate how runaway captives imagined their battered and torn bare feet as signs of resilience and commitment to revolution and liberation. This narrative attention to feet is echoed in the Black art historical canon, which allows us to reconsider the compositional power of the image in mobilizing radical looking practices that see feet for their fugitive qualities. Often composed to signal various scales and visions of Black freedom, I turn to how feet demarcate the fugitive possibilities of escape within regimes of anti-Black terror in the works of Jacob Lawrence. The most striking of these works is a 1940s series on Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, and I believe it best captures this emphasis on bare feet. Tubman, as we know, was an abolitionist celebrated for her lawlessness as a figure that guided slaves to their freedom through the fugitive practice of escape under the cover of night. In this biographical series, Lawrence sequenced key moments in Tubman's life across 31 captioned panels and utilized his famed techniques of bold colors and flattened figures to make the narrative easily accessible as a kind of picture book of Tubman's life. As we gather from the images in front of you, Lawrence emphasized feet in several of the panels. Shackles, which bind the feet to a particular place of confinement, mark the conditions of captivity in some panels, while others highlight the escape from restriction into open yet ominous pastures leading to nowhere in particular. However, Lawrence is careful not to give us the false promise of the purely pastoral. Instead, these open fields are saturated in dark blues and blacks, magnifying the unknown and treacherous futures that escape brings. Just as in Genet's portrayal of how the natural world, the tree, is stained by lynching, Lawrence's paintings give us a landscape fraught with the terrors of violence and uncertainties of freedom. In a late addition to the series added in 1967 entitled Daybreak, A Time to Rest, Tubman is lying on her back and gazing at the sky above while embracing a rifle. Her feet, which take over the canvas and our vision, are disproportionately scaled, even deformed, in relation to the rest of her body. Large and grotesque, calloused and worn, Tubman's feet are the painting subject. Lawrence deforms the plane, the scale of the body, and our vision through his figuration of Tubman's feet. Deformation is a strategy crucial to Black artistic practice, and here the strategy operates to enliven the fugitive qualities of escape practiced by Tubman herself. Her feet tell us something the rest of her body does not. The underside of her bare feet, where her skin meets the ground, mobilizes the intensity of her lawlessness, of her status as an accomplice, if not conduit, for fugitive slaves committing illegal acts of escape. Our vision is consumed by her fugitivity, running from the very law that mandates her captivity, fungibility, and expendability. This visualization of Black liberation is tinged with the very capture that mandates the escape in the first place. Tubman's feet, then, are the vessels that make escape the means for Black liberation. In that spirit, Jackson's feet communicate two simultaneous reminders. First, they invoke how feet, as an index of dismemberment, provide an alternative measurement of Black corporeality. In this double provocation, the Black body extends understandings of corporeality beyond the scope of the unified whole. Instead, the dismembered or disproportionate Black corpus was a tool that visualized the revolutionary potential of Black corporeality. Secondly, these exaggerated feet also contain the possibility of Black resistance through the figure of the runaway slave. Knowing that Jackson's attempted prison escape warranted his murder, his feet come to signal the very dangers of enacting one's freedom. After all, his feet led him to his death. Mirroring tales of runaway slaves who attempted to enact their freedom and thus risked imminent death through escape, the feet and power to the people George galvanized resistance. To take one's freedom through escape, through the use of one's feet, is to activate a vision of Black freedom that understands death as a likely possibility, but risks life to pursue a radical collective future. While Power to the People George repurposes various looking practices inherited through Black dispossession, this poster also posits a notion of Black futurity. Black futurity here signals a vision of Black freedom that locates the site of Black resistance from the slave plantation to the tree to the prison cell. In other words, in this vision, prison and all the institutions and practices that make that place possible must be terrains upon which Black radicals combat dispossession and violence. In so doing, prison abolition would require a set of imaginative tools that could account for the end of anti-Black violence and the beginnings of new ways of inhabiting Black corporeality. Black futurity signals the interwoven and all-encompassing terrain of the Black freedom struggle in order to visualize and enact transgressions of corporeality that aim to undo the desire for wholeness. Instead, these practices wish to enliven the possibility of corporeal restitution. In this poster, Black futurity opens up visual and aesthetic conditions of possibility for the Black freedom struggle in order to suggest that death can motivate revolution. By establishing the conditions through which looking practices are inhabited by anti-Black violence and extending corporeality to include dismemberment and fugitivity, these images offer a profound intervention in theories of the Black body. Power to the People, George visualizes Jackson's dead body as a way to engage revolutionary praxis as outlaws or fugitives working towards the end of the world so that we can begin the construction of a new one. Thank you.
That was completely incredible. Thank you so much. And there's so many ways to start. The students have really interesting questions. And one of them I think would be interesting to talk about. There are a couple different directions. One of them is this sort of line between abstraction and figurative work, because your article deals a lot with abstraction. So maybe in a moment to touch on that. But a number of the students were really interested in where you might see contemporary examples of the kind of futurity that you describe in this body of work. What kind of artists are you seeing today? I mean, certainly with the movements that have taken place over the past year, we see a lot of this futurity that you describe. But in regard to artists carrying on this tradition, where are you seeing that in contemporary work?
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, there's a show up in St. Louis at the Speed Art Museum right now called Power, Witness, Remembrance, curated by Allison Glenn. And it's in response to Breonna Taylor's, brutal murder. And there's a lot of really interesting conversations that are emerging out of that show about the role and the place of contemporary art. And I think that show has a roll call of works. Some are really kind of explicit, right? Like Amy Sherald's quite beautiful portrait of Breonna Taylor. And some are more gestural or ephemeral or poetic, like Sam Gillam's, some of his hanging canvases are featured there. And I think, it's a question that's a hard one because, my background is not in art history or even in art practice. I come from a background in politics and feminist studies. So, I was really a movement student, a student of movements, and the Black Power movement, and specifically the Black Panthers as an organization, were really compelling to me and were responsible for my politicization at a young age. And so much of the work that I'm looking at in this project and definitely in this book are like poster makers and artists who are working in collaboration with the movement for Black liberation. And so, they use the word propaganda like as a pride, right? Like, this is what we're doing. So I say all that to say that, we're living in a radically different time, even though as much as things change, they stay the same. And so I find it even more dynamic and interesting that we're able, right? We have like an archive of sources that we can run artists who are working in a contemporary moment parallel to historic artists, right? So I say all that to say there's folks like Sadie Barnette, who I'm super excited by, who, are being shown next to artists like Emory Douglas, right? Artists like Patrick Martinez out of Los Angeles, of course, Kambui Olujimi out of New York, and Yeshua Klaus. And these artists are really thinking about, they're making work that is constantly signaling back into that history of a Black artistic practice. And I think that's crucial and fundamental, right, to how we think about how to make sense of our current political moment, because otherwise it just seems so overwhelming, right? If we're constantly working in this sense that like we have to always be responsive and reactive, and it can feel draining. It feels so much more grounding and like you're a part of a bigger moment if you're able to turn to the history, right, of artists working in the same tradition. And so,
well, and also this idea that the history is the future, right? That they're inextricably linked. Right now we have the Bisa Butler show, which, students, anyone who hasn't seen that show, highly recommended. And exactly to the strategy you described, they have Afrocobra poster work. hanging there to show exactly this idea that the history, the past, present, and future are nested, and they build on one another. But you took me on a perfect bent, because I want to hear more about your personal awakening through activist posters, because some of the students have asked about, how does art create change? I mean, on a really basic level. And it sounds like you have an incredible personal story there to share. So I'd really love to hear that.
Yeah, I was, it's like, I feel like we all kind of had this teacher at a young age who like gave us this book. And then it's like, and mine was Michael Kreger, who taught English at my high school. And he handed me Angela Davis's autobiography. And I kind of never looked back. I was like, okay, I'm going to go to college. I'm going to work with Professor Davis, kind of, um, and I was lucky enough to get into Santa Cruz, and then UC Santa Cruz in my life kind of changed from there, in the sense that I was able to engage in like a really deep study of not just like histories of radical social movements, but also, theories that are fundamental to how we think. And actually, I came to the art of it all quite late in my own process of politicization. But I say that to say that it was always there. I just like wasn't looking, like it was so a part of the atmosphere of how I developed a sense of self, that it wasn't until I realized like, oh my gosh, the aesthetic is so formative, and how it's so foundational. It's just as foundational as the written word was, right? I just was not trained through the education system I came up with in the US to kind of look for that, right? Or like to be able to like sense that was so necessary. And so I think, part of what is fundamental for me in my story is that I think I showed that image, for example, of the cover of Soledad Brother, right? That book. That's like the exact copy that I have. Sorry, not Soledad Brother, Blood in My Eye. It's the exact copy that I have, right? The exact one that I got in the college bookstore. Like, it was like secondhand, third hand, and I read that thing to shreds, right? And so focused for years on Jackson's words that I never looked at the cover. And then like after years I looked at the cover and I realized the cover is made by Emory Douglas, right? He illustrates the cover of that book. And it just like was such a light bulb moment. Like, it's such a simple thing, but it's such a light bulb moment to be like, these processes are hand in hand, right? Artists and writers and thinkers and scholars and, we're all culture makers, and we like are embedded. It's like two sides of the same coin. And that's like just one of many examples where I was like, wait, this is like fundamental to how I understand this book, right? And it's Emory Douglas is the cover of it, right?
And
all these posters. Yeah.
And as we discussed, some of my students this week are studying Emory Douglas, in the panorama of these conversations around activist posters and the legacies here in the Midwest and in Chicagoland. So it's really thought-provoking too, this idea of the book as this document that kind of stays with you and you continue to return to and becomes this, iconographic document. It's really very compelling. So one of the students answered or asked something pretty interesting, which I think is a nice way to build here. In terms of, so far we've discussed things that are physical objects and also two-dimensional artworks. So this one really stuck out to me. You mentioned the unique relationship between subject and viewer created in Black art because of the hyper-awareness of surveillance and supervision over Black people that pervades most violence against Black bodies. All of the work you discussed in the article is approximately 15 years or more older. Today, facial recognition and surveillance are more prevalent than ever. How do you think the digital revolution has shaped this narrative for a new generation of artists? I thought that was a particularly great question.
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And I'm such a Luddite, I have to say. Like, I am so terrible like all like, it's like math for me. I'm just like, oof, the language of it. But I will say that Simone Brown's book completely like turned something on for me. And in that book, she kind of talks specifically about digital technologies and, how racist they are, right? They're extensions of a human world that is grounded on white supremacy. And so therefore they replicate those same kinds of ideologies and structures and frameworks that that are formed out of the way that our own eyes are trained to see through like white Western normative principles of seeing and looking. And she takes that seed, right, that little nugget, and puts it into a conversation on modes of surveillance, digital, and even kind of, digital modes of surveillance. But she also continuously brings it back to like 19th century practices, 19th century technologies. So she's constantly, thinking about, for example, Alan Sekula's famed essay, The Body in Archive. I think I'm getting that right? I'm having like a 7:00 a brain exhaustion thing, but that, where he's thinking specifically about the mugshot, right? And like the role of the mugshot as a kind of technology of policing. And she extends that into thinking about like the database, right? And like what data do we have that grounds how these machines are taught to see? And then, right, how do specifically, we know, for example, that these technologies are not trained to see darker skin and specifically Black people. And then how do like Black people, artists, everyday kind of like people, right, how do they juke the system, right? How do they use that kind of invisibility as a mode of resistance, right? As a way to say like, wait, do we actually want to be seen by these things? Like, do we actually want to live in a world where like our faces are like quickly become data sets? And yeah, so these are kinds of, I'm thinking, I say, I'm going to respond to the question to say that has completely shifted how I think about, for example, like 21st century modes of visibility, right? So, and modes of visibility that are particularly like radical and resistant. So the idea, for example, of like images going viral, right? And we see this, it's like so palpable. It's in the room with us right now. It's in the air we breathe, so to speak, that like, we are on the one hand given these extreme and also extremely banal and quotidian images of graphic violence against Black people on the regular. And that has also been the source of a kind of like match, right, of the viral like modes and bites of resistance that are kind of like emerging and that blanket, right, our everyday lives. Now, it's interesting because I think the question of the image is still up for grabs. Like, from what I can tell, like the kind of tweet and the like words still tend to be the like mainly trafficked kind of mode of resistance. Although you see, like back to kind of Amy Sherald's portrait of Breonna Taylor, that was kind of everywhere, right? Like that had a kind of distribution that was constant. And so that kind of circulation was super important. But I do want to just say that kind of circulation also has a history, right? The political poster, like I kind of mentioned very quickly in passing, was like never meant to live. It was meant to just like be a flashpoint. And because the revolution was going to happen. Like we didn't need these images anymore, right? They were going to like be on street corners and dorm rooms and blah, blah, blah in people's hands, but they weren't supposed to be these precious objects, right? They were meant to be circulated very quickly, and they were often, right? For the technology of that time, they were circulated really quickly. so there is a precedent to it, right? As much as like we live in a world that is, I would agree, like digitized and more ephemeral, it's also kind of rooted in those very kind of 20th century practices as well.
Well, and you also described sort of the fundamental contradiction between surveillance and also the video as a document of reality. So you have this, the video basically functions on two planes. What you're describing too, in terms of the effect of an image, the effect of spectatorship, the way viewing is, it reinforces white supremacy, is one aspect. And the other aspect, of course, is that video has provided a document of reality in ways that is unprecedented in contemporary culture, which gives rise to the revolution. But at the same time, that doesn't address how those images themselves reinforce trauma. I mean, those are two very important aspects. So building on, the work that you showed us tonight was highly figurative. And I think that that's super fascinating to think about in terms of iconographies and color schemes and a lot of artistic strategies around the things you described about dismemberment, about corporeality in the body. And then on the other hand, in your article, Blackouts and Other Visual Escapes in Art Journal, which you won your award for, the students read that, and you've got this really nice different tactic here talking about abstraction and the ways that abstraction creates a different kind of viewership. Something the students responded to, a number of them, was black, the color black, and the ways that black interacts with viewership and visibility. So can you talk a little bit about, sort of the ways that abstraction is different from the figurative work and how it functions visually?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want to start by saying that like all generative concepts, the concept of abstraction is vexed, right? It's a troubled one in the sense that on the one hand, when we think about specifically kind of, when we think about the term as it relates to Blackness or Black history, right? Black studies scholars have given us a really rich vocabulary to think about how that term indicates a kind of violence, right? So I'm thinking here of the works of somebody like Hortense Spillers, of course, and her kind of like, it's like one of those essays when you end, you have to start again, right? Mama's Baby, Papa's Maybe, an American grammar book that she published in 1987, where she doesn't use the term abstraction explicitly, but she is talking about the kind of evacuation, right? The mode with which through the Middle Passage, captives were drained of their humanity, right? That they were abstracted into quantifiable sums. So it wasn't, X amount of people in the hold of the ship, it was X amount of cargo, right? And so sentient beings, people, were placed next to, barrels of sugar or sheep or spices. And that's what the inventory log gives us. And so that archive demonstrates, right? The inventory log gives us an archive, and that archive demonstrates the violence of abstraction when we think about, Black history. And so I want to kind of start there because I think, and she's, of course, Spillers isn't the only one. I mean, Spillers is like a god for me. So I always kind of go to her, but she's not the only one, right? Saidiya Hartman in Scenes of Subjection thinks about this. And of course, Huey Copeland thinks about this in Bound to Appear as well, right? That it's that when we think about the abstracted, we should always kind of have in the back of our head that the abstracted has this kind of underbelly of a history, right? So what do we do with that? Right? We can't just kind of think then that like, and of course, like that history is always kind of running underneath all of these kinds of aesthetic terms that are bouncing on top of it. So of course, abstraction, when we're in like art since 1945 or whatever, unless you're taking class with me or Huey or, a few of us that do this, Krista Thompson, right? You're not going to get that when you're given the term abstraction, you're given a different history, right? A history that is about the non-figurative, the non-representational, right? Something that is about the expressive, something that is about a certain kind of post-war turn, right? After 1945, like, what do we do, right? After the Holocaust, what do we do? What does it mean to paint? What does it mean to paint figures? Like, can we even do that? Right? And that question has always kind of been present as an urtext for, I believe, Black artists in the US context, which is what I primarily study. And I'm sure that it trespasses the boundaries of the US as well. So that idea that I'm kind of thinking about in Blackouts and Other Visual Escapes, and also in this chapter of abstraction, right? Part of what I want to get to is like that violence is there in the term, right? In the emptying out of humans, right? Of people, right? The emptying out of that, their status as people, into, and that transformation into the object status, right? From subject to object. So if that's the kind of the spine, right? The kind of foundation, then what do we do with like histories of abstraction in this kind of like art world, aesthetic, art history sense? And specifically Black histories of abstraction, where clearly these artists are cognizant, right? They live in the very bodies that have been determined as objects instead of subjects. And part of that determination is grounded in this very kind of, in the formation of race itself, right? And the formation of race itself is dependent on looking in many, among other things, right? But it's based in sight, right? And so, and this is a very kind of the simplest way to put this. The simplest way to put this is that, when we say Black skin, right, the color that I'm wearing here on my vest is very different than the color that we signal and signify when we're thinking about Black skin. So like, I know all this is being recorded and I'm like out into the universe, but like, please, like, apologies for how crudely and how quickly I'm running through some of this. It's like very, okay, so I say that to say that like Black already signals for us a variety of things, right? From skin color to the color of my fabric that I'm wearing here, right? Chromatically, it's already giving us a bunch of confusions, right? It's already giving us a bunch of ambiguities, a bunch of question marks. And so Black artists who think about that at the level of color, which is a very central concern in the question of abstraction, right, is color in many ways, are trying to kind of get into the muck of that, right? Get into the muck of when we say Black, we are already like sending out a bunch of signals of a bunch of stuff that don't seem to come together, but in many ways are the kind of seedbed or the foundation of a Western white normative framework. So, okay, now like, how do we get to the color Black, right? So when I'm thinking specifically about like Witten and definitely Carrie James Marshall in that Black painting, right? I wish I had the image. Maybe I'll find it and I can put it up for us. The color Black is, a contested color in in color, in kind of color theory, right? Somebody like Fred Moten, who really I'm kind of building off of in this, he's not the only one, right? It's like the debate can be crudely reduced to, is it the absence of color or is it the summation of all colors, right? And if you, depending on what side of the line you're on, you get a whole bunch of political and social meanings, right? If Black is the container of all colors in the color spectrum, that gives us a radically different outcome than Black is the absence of color, right? It's the negation of color, right? You can hear it already in how it's racialized in this way, right? So when I'm thinking about somebody like Kerry James Marshall, for example, who we know like is a master at the color black, right? Like he does, if you look at a Kerry James Marshall and you try to tell me there's only one kind of black, one kind of color black, like we are not in the same world. We're not even in the same universe, right? He gives us like the plural, the maximum plurals of that color. And what that does when you look at something for me like the black painting is it throws in, and I'm sorry, I'm thinking of a painting from 1999 that he does of Fred Hampton's room right before the FBI and the Chicago Police Department come in and horrendously murder Hampton, right? And it's on acrylic, and it's just this incredibly like difficult to see painting. And I believe that what he does there, right, is he's calling us into the potentiality of that radical non-transparency, right? He's calling us into this idea, like, what if we, that the impenetrability, right? The difficulty to like actually see the images that he's giving us in that work is a form of abstracted labor, right? It's a form that forces us to reposition ourselves, to like get into different heights, to squat down, to do all of these things. It puts the onus on the viewer to have to work to look at what we're seeing. And in so doing, it's also protecting in some level, right? The subjects of the painting who on first glance don't even appear, right? It just looks like a black square from a distance. It looks like an abstracted, right? The Malevich of all Malevich's black squares. And you come up close and you see the dynamics, the kind of the forms that are emerging, the figures that are there, right? And I think that really what that is a kind of critique that somebody like Edouard Glissant, the famed Martinican poet and theorist, has given us, that like transparency is a violent expectation. The expectation that non-white people should be transparent to white people is a violence. And opacity is what we should be thinking about and looking at and activating, right? Opacity is an act of protection. It's an act of making somebody else work for it, right? It's a radical refusal of a Western hegemonic demand that we make ourselves transparent at the level of sight and everything else.
Well, and it's also a challenge to the actual technique itself, the canon of the technique. And any painter, anybody who studied painting, you have to mix your black. You can't take a black out of a tube, you got to mix it. And
yep.
The title of his show, Mastery, right? Playing with this idea of the master artist, the master on the plantation. The inflection points on those works are many and varied.
Yeah.
So Sam is going to ask a question from our chat, which I believe came in from Joan Giroux.
Awesome. I'm sorry I ranted there too.
Nope, that is amazing, because listen, this is where this was so distinctly different from what you showed that I think it gave people a lot to think about in terms of that article really presented a whole other symbolic representation of radical power, of Blackness, and of revolution. So.
Yeah. Sam, can I, before you jump into the question, I just want to show, people might not be familiar with the work. So do you mind if I just show it really quick, that Marshall piece? Okay, here it is. See, it's also challenging to photograph, but I just want to give people a sense of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this work specifically. Okay. Thank you for indulging me.
Yeah, of course. And there's a lot of visual artists here, so having that context is very beneficial for us to further understand everything. So my question comes from Joan Giroux in the chat, and it says, can you speak about relationships you see between the political activist poster for the Black Power movement and the work that ACT UP undertook in the 80s, and the work of Pound No DAPL very recently?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I wish I had more to say about it, Joan. That's a fantastic, fantastic question. One thing that has always kind of like really, it lives with me is Douglas Crimp. I read something years ago, and he was kind of reflecting specifically about ACT UP and thinking about the pink triangle and, you know, these kinds of the no silence kind of posters that were kind of circulating, and that image specifically. And he, you know, was reflecting specifically on the kind of ways that a culture war, right, is not just something that is, it's not just, it doesn't just belong, it's not the property of the state or the right? That like, that in a grassroots sense, like we should enact culture wars, right? And I believe this was Crimp, and I could be totally misremembering, but and there was a moment where specifically there was a kind of like return to the Black Power era, right? And this kind of reflection on the culture wars that existed, that the Panthers were so successful in waging. And I think that those kinds of intersectional histories are so crucial, right? It's crucial for us to think about the ways that the political poster, for example, in some ways could be the analog, right? Or the kind of template. Because it wasn't, and I want to be clear, like it wasn't the Panthers that did it first, of course not, right? But they activated that template, and other practitioners in the Black Power movement activated that template in order to extend out a reach into the future, right? So ACT UP posters, for example, or even like the ACT UP movement as a culture war, as a war at the level of presentation, right, of visibility of certain kinds of demands, was very much hearkening, right, or citing, I should say, citing a Black Power vocabulary, or I'll say a Black Power visual vocabulary, and some of their declarations at the level of graphics, text, right, the kind of like reproducibility of the image. I also kind of see that in the pipeline protests, right? And I will say though that like what has always kind of struck me in the pipeline protests is the way that Native and Indigenous artists and organizers are so overwhelmingly fearless in the way that they utilize images of genocide, right? Or attempted genocide, I should say. I should correct my own language there. Attempted genocide, in order to jettison the power of resistance. And that language at the level of like a visual production was also something the Panthers were themselves, they said they were indebted to, right? Like they were indebted to kind of Indigenous representations of attempted genocide as a way to like make sense of their own living history. So I know, Joan, I'm so sorry that was like definitely not a graceful answer to your question, but I think it's there. You know, I've been seeing, and then, you know, there's also the other side of this question, which is like a co-optation, like not in a rich sense, like not in a radical sense, right? A co-optation that's very much in a kind of commercial sense that's also happening on some of these, around some of these images and some of these movements that should probably make us like have our backs up a little bit as well, right?
You know, it's really, it's a nice segue into a couple of things, but this conversation has been very broad and so fascinating to consider. There's another question about student engagement. And I'm just wondering, are you familiar with the Project Stand archive that's going on now? It's really interesting and apropos some of the work that you showed us tonight. But just thinking about the objects of or the posters and images of revolution and the manner in which they're made at the time, which is for distribution, not necessarily for historical posterity, right? But Project Stand is archiving student activism from history to present, starting mostly with civil rights and early feminist movements, and taking these objects that were meant to just be on the street, and in many cases just used for a day, and turning them into research objects, right? Yeah, and I'm wondering what you're seeing right now. This is a little tangential to another question about what you think about our sort of essential student movements of activism right now, but I'm wondering what kind of objects you may have come across that fall into this category of activist images, even memes or objects that become the voice of a generation in the way that somebody, Emory Douglas is often described as the person who's the visual voice of the movement, right? I'm not an expert on whether he intended that from the beginning, but from what you described, there were many points of visual production, material production that were never intended to become viral in the way that they would have been at the time. So what kind of things are we seeing today that you think have really had that kind of transformative potential?
Yeah, that's super exciting. I have so many places to go. So one place I want to go is Emma Solkowitz's incredible set of performances out of Columbia University, right? What was that, like 2013, 2012 now?
What a great example.
Yeah. So the mattress, right? As this kind of, for those who are, you should definitely Google Emma Solkowitz, but she was an art student at Columbia University who was raped. And, it's a story, unfortunately, that's very common, right? Went up all the way up, like lodged all of these complaints across the administration at her university, was not heard, was forced to still be in classes with this person. And as an act, she was an art student. Did I mention that already? As an act, as a performance piece, she carried around a mattress with her, right, to all of her classes. And, while that was unfolding, I just remember thinking, this is like, an incredibly poetic and like, goosebump inducing invocation of how that violence is with us. And I believe she called it carry that weight, right? And when she couldn't, carry this mattress like up the stairs or into buildings, her friends would help her and strangers would help her. And it became this kind of interrelational, right? Social. And this is before Me Too, right? This is kind of, this is in a moment where it wasn't really on the tip of our tongues to be able to think about or talk about, specifically rape, right? Rape culture and violence at the level of rape on a kind of with ease, as I think it is now, or with a certain kind of boldness. And, at her graduation, right, when she matriculated out of Columbia, many people she didn't even know in the university also brought mattresses, right, to their commencement ceremony as a way to not only articulate, that they too were rape survivors, many of them, but many of them also did that as an act of solidarity. And I think that's kind of one example of this. Now, there are so many, and I'm just like I said, I'm a Luddite, and I'm also like, I'm officially old, I feel like, which I'm totally proud and I wear as a badge. But my 12-year-old like teaches me a lot about things like TikTok. And I am, the other kind of example, I don't know why that popped into my head, was, this kind of the like incredible Gen Zers who pranked Donald Trump at his you know, I mean, dare I say his name, right? But like at his rally where they bought all the like, or they like registered for the event and it was like totally empty, right? These are also kind of, I think about that in the spirit of somebody like Larry Bogad has written this great book called Electoral Guerrilla Politics, and he calls himself like a political clown, right? He's like constantly in the spirit of like the yes men, right? If people are unaware of who the yes men are, these kinds of ways of pranking, right? And like turning our understanding of the political on its head, which I think is so crucial to constantly be expanding what we think of as political gestures. And
well, and you directly answered one of the students' questions about other media, right?
Oh,
so you talked about performance. We've gone from, you know, painting and two-dimensional objects, you know, things like posters. Now we're talking about performance. And one of the students asked also about sculpture, which is kind of interesting. I mean, are there any physical objects you can think of? I mean, of course, the whole monument movement that we just experienced this year would be to some degree an embodiment of the object as a revolutionary tactic. And
no, there's, I'm thinking specifically of, I mean, there's Castle's very kind of, their famous kind of performance where they had like a giant wet concrete block, and they did a performance where they boxed the block in a totally dark room and only had the flash of a photographer kind of take images. That was the after image. Those images were the only things we had. And then that object, right, that block that was molded by their fists became a monument, right, for the kind of violent and gruesome ongoing murders of trans people in this country and beyond. And so that piece, I think of in terms of sculpture, right, Castle's work. I mean, I know my colleague David Getze probably has like so many examples of this at the helm. But yeah, the conversations around monuments are super interesting. Kehinde Wiley's, for example, a piece that traveled right from New York to Virginia. But you know, I'm also kind of interested in, there are these other kinds of registers that maybe are like more, that pave less permanent forms of resistance, right? That are about kind of activating a sense or a feeling or a recollection or a body position. And that to me is super interesting, because on the one hand, like I want to be careful not to kind of reduce politics only to our individual selves as these singular units, right? But on the other hand, I think that we have to be able to think of the micro and the macro and the micro, right? The way that we might be unwittingly, unknowingly reiterating forms of violence that go beyond, you know, or I shouldn't say that go beyond, but that exist alongside like the words we use and the way that we speak and think, right? They go into like how we hold ourselves and what histories we are enacting when we look at a piece of art or when we cross somebody on the train. Right.
Yeah, and I think too of that incredible Robert E. Lee monument in Virginia, which, I mean, the photographs of it now just completely covered in, you know, this palimpsest of text and just an incredible, I mean, this whole question, like, will it stay? And the whole idea of the monument as an act of violence, a continued act of violence, and yet it's been transformed. There were also projections taking place, which changed over time and became, you know, moving, performative. But that whether it should stay, you know, just the reinstatement of violence through an object like that, yet it had been transformed, at least in part. And these are really complex questions, and there's a lot of conversation here in Chicago about monuments right now, and the Ida B. Wells monument, which Michelle Duster, her great granddaughter, who teaches part-time at Columbia, Richard Hunt, who will be, you know, the visual maker for that, and whether it will be abstract or what, you know, what it will actually look like. We did an exercise with the students to visualize what that might be. You know, if they had to design it, would it be figurative? Would it be abstract? What would it engage? Would it engage words? Would it, you know, would it be performative and not permanent? So, you know, these are really interesting questions.
Yeah.
Very thought-provoking. So wondering if there are any other questions from the audience. And if not, we just have a few minutes until we're done. I really enjoyed being able to talk to you in greater depth. You know, this was very I also appreciate getting your personal history on how you became interested in this work. I think sometimes we forget what those deep histories are.
Yeah.
And
no, entirely.
Yeah.
And I come from a, my personal history is like where none of us are free until Black people are free, until Indigenous people are free in this country. So, I had, I always say this and I feel a little bit like a broken record, but I think that it's an important thing to bring into the space, right? Even if it is a digital space. And I, was lucky enough to be in a seminar room one day with Fred Moten, and he, said this thing that was like, oof, it was like so to the point, which is like, we're all sitting at this table because of the Middle Passage, right? If it wasn't for the Middle Passage, we wouldn't be here. And I think just kind of taking that as a way, as like, as an indication of gathering, right, is also a part of our stories. So I want to kind of, emphasize that like, we might think that these kinds of questions and these kinds of impacts are far from us, right? If we don't fall into the legibility, the space of legibility, right? Of we're either this or that, but ultimately, none of us would be sitting at this table, so to speak, if it wasn't for that, life-changing, earth-changing, universe-changing act of the Middle Passage. And so we have to take that on, right? And we have to be able to, and it's not the only thing, I'm not saying it's the only thing we have to take on, but I think it is a crucial part of all of our stories. And it's a part of our stories that we should take quite seriously.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for such an incredibly rich conversation, very important, very moving. We're really proud to have you join us. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for making time and for having me.
Please join us on April 28th for Lily K's, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you again, Sampada.
Thanks a lot.